The fortress of Ashenmoor had no name in the language of men. What they called it, the Dark Spire, the Bleeding Throne, the place where the sun refuses to rise, were all descriptions born from fear rather than fact. The sun did rise over Ashenmoor, it simply looked different from there. Filtered through volcanic ash and ancient wards, it arrived each morning as a bruised, amber light that painted everything in shades of copper and shadow. Kael Draeven had watched that same sunrise from the same window for 400 years, and he still had not decided whether he found it beautiful or suffocating. He was not what the stories said he was. This was not a claim of innocence. He had done terrible things. He had leveled cities that threatened his borders, broken alliances with his bare hands, and spoken words to kings that had ended dynasties. He had earned every name the human kingdoms gave him, and he wore those names with the same deliberate calm that he wore everything else as armor. But armor, by its nature, hides what it covers. Kael was tall, the kind of tall that rearranged a room when he entered it. His hair was black without variation, cut close on the sides and slightly longer at the crown, and his eyes were the deep, particular grey of a sky deciding whether to storm. His skin held the faint iridescence of old magic, not a glow, nothing as theatrical as a glow, but a quality, as if light moved across it the way it moves across still water. The two horns that curved from his temples were smooth and dark, their shape elegant rather than fearsome, though he knew that no human ever saw them that way in the beginning. He ruled Ashenmoor and its surrounding territories, the charred wastes, the midnight marsh, the ridge of hollowed kings, with an efficiency that his council respected and his enemies resented. He held court twice a week, settled disputes with a precision that left little room for argument, and maintained a standing army that he had not needed to deploy in 60 years. Order, in his opinion, was the most undervalued form of mercy. The prophecy had been given to him in the 63rd year of his reign, delivered by a dying oracle who had clawed her way to his throne room through sheer force of spiritual obligation. He remembered her face clearly, the way her eyes had gone silver, the way her voice had come from somewhere deeper than her body. Two powers drawn from opposite ends of creation will find each other before the century turns. Their meeting is inevitable. Their destruction of each other is written. One born of fire and shadow, one born of light and living things, cannot exist in the same space without consuming it. She had died before she finished speaking, which Kael had always considered cosmically rude. He had not thought about the prophecy in nearly 40 years. There were more immediate concerns: a drought in the eastern territories, a trade dispute with the Merchant Council of Verdane, the slow but persistent erosion of the northern wards. He had a kingdom to govern. He did not have time to spend 4 centuries worrying about someone he had never met. Then the scouts brought her in, and he thought about the prophecy very much. Her name was Seren Vael, and she had been found unconscious in the midnight marsh, tangled in the roots of the iron thorn trees at the marsh's deepest edge, far past where any sane traveller ventured. She carried no weapons that the scouts could find, no supplies, and no markings of any kingdom they recognized. What she did carry was a light, not visible exactly, not something you could point to and name, but a warmth that 3 of the scout company reported separately and without prompting, an unusual sensation of standing in sunlight even in the middle of the marsh's permanent dusk. His head council wanted her imprisoned, his general wanted her questioned and released. His ward keeper, an old demon named Sura, whose instincts Kael trusted more than any strategy map, said one thing when he asked her opinion: "She's the other half of that thing the oracle told you." Kael had her brought to the East Wing, which was neither a prison nor a guest room, but something in between, comfortable enough to be humane, contained enough to be cautious. She woke arguing. He heard her from the corridor, a voice that carried remarkable clarity for someone who had apparently spent an indeterminate amount of time unconscious in a marsh. By the time he reached the door, she was already in negotiation with the attendant about the lock, making a reasoned case for why her continued containment violated 3 separate conventions of neutral travel, 2 of which he would later discover she had invented on the spot. He opened the door himself, which was not something he typically did. She stopped mid-sentence. He watched her take him in, the horns, the height, the grey eyes, all of it, and he waited for the fear that followed, the way people's expressions reorganized themselves into something smaller and more careful. Instead, she did something he had not anticipated. Her eyes sharpened with what could only be described as professional interest. "You're Kael Draeven," she said. "I am," he said. "Then you're the one who had me locked in here." "Also correct." She crossed her arms. She was shorter than him by a significant measure, dressed in travel clothes that had not fared well in the marsh, with dark brown hair that had dried in directions that defied explanation and eyes the color of new leaves in spring, a green that was almost uncomfortable in its aliveness, full of something warm and particular that made the rest of the room look slightly less vivid by comparison. "I wasn't trespassing," she said. "I was following a migration path of lumen beetles through the marsh. They cross through your territory every 4 years. I've documented the last 3 cycles. I have the notes." Kael looked at her for a moment. "You nearly died in my marsh following beetles." "Luminescent invertebrates," she said without the slightest defensiveness. "And I didn't nearly die, I was resting." "You were unconscious and partially submerged." "I was very tired." He leaned against the doorframe, which was unusual for him, as he generally did not lean on things. "Who are you?" "Seren Vael, scholar, natural historian, researcher attached to the Academy of Living Sciences in Coldenmere." She paused. "You haven't heard of it." "I've heard of Coldenmere, but not the Academy." "The Academy of Living Sciences is a building with 12 students and a very ambitious mission statement," he said, because Sura had already given him a report. "You're its only field researcher." Something shifted in her expression, not embarrassment, but a kind of rueful acknowledgement. "That's accurate," she said, "but the work is legitimate regardless of institutional size." He had fully intended to send her home in the morning with an escort and a formal warning about future incursions. He had made the decision in the corridor before opening the door, but standing there, looking at her standing there, he found himself revising that plan without quite committing to a reason why. "The eastern path through my territory is impassable for the next 2 weeks," he said instead. "The northern wards are being reset and the disruption makes travel dangerous." This was true. "And the southern route?" she asked. "Flooded." "Also true." "So I'm staying," she said, and it was not a question so much as an observation made to herself, something she was adding to an internal list of facts about her current situation. "For 2 weeks," he said, "you'll have the use of the East Wing Library and the Southern Gardens. You won't enter the fortress proper without my permission, and you won't go near the ward structures." "Can I document the fauna in the Southern Gardens?" He had not expected that question. "Within reason." "What constitutes reason in your definition?" He looked at her steadily. "I'll know it when I see a violation of it." She considered this and apparently decided it was workable, because she nodded once with the efficient confidence of someone accepting the terms of a manageable arrangement. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Kael Draeven." No one called him Kael Draeven. They called him my lord, or they called him Demon Lord, or they called him things they hoped he couldn't hear. The use of his full name, offered plainly without ceremony, was disarming in a way he hadn't anticipated. He left without responding, which was a retreat, though he would not have named it that. That night, sitting alone at the window where he had watched 400 sunrises, he thought about the oracle's words, one born of fire and shadow, one born of light and living things. He had assumed all those years ago that the other half of the prophecy would announce itself obviously, that he would know at once that there would be some dramatic convergence of power, some unmistakable sign. He had not expected a woman with marsh-tangled hair making a case for luminescent beetles. The 2 weeks passed without the southern route flooding or the northern wards being completed. This was not entirely a coincidence. Kael delayed the ward reset by 3 days, citing conditions that were real but not critical. He did not examine his reasons closely, because examining them would have required a level of honesty that he was not yet prepared for. What he told himself was that she was interesting. What he told himself was that the research she was conducting in the southern gardens was harmless, that having a scholar from the outside world present was diplomatically useful, that any number of practical considerations justified extending her stay. What actually happened was that he found himself going to the southern gardens in the late afternoon. He told himself this was to check on the boundaries of her movement, to ensure she wasn't approaching anything restricted. The first time this was at least partially true. By the third visit he was aware that it wasn't, and he went anyway. She was always absorbed in something specific. He'd find her crouched beside a particular moss formation, making notes in a leather journal that was already so full it barely closed, or standing very still near the stone wall at the garden's edge, watching something he couldn't immediately identify until she'd pointed out, a spider constructing a web pattern she claimed was architecturally unusual, a small lizard with iridescent scales that she was almost certain was a new subspecies. She noticed things in extraordinary detail and without any apparent anxiety about whether what she noticed mattered to anyone else. He found this quality unexpectedly restful. The first real conversation happened on the 5th day. He had been standing at the garden entrance for several minutes before she noticed him, which in itself was unusual. Most people became aware of his presence well before he spoke. "Do you want to come closer, or is observation from the doorway the preferred method?" she asked, without looking up from the journal. He came closer. He sat on the low stone wall across from where she was working, which was something he had never done in the southern gardens in 400 years. The stone was warm from the day's copper light. "What are you documenting?" he asked. She turned the journal toward him. The page held detailed, careful drawings of a flower that grew near the garden wall, a deep violet bloom that he had always considered simply decorative. "This species," she said, "it doesn't grow anywhere else in this region. The soil composition in your garden supports it because of the residual ward energy in the ground. Essentially, your magical infrastructure is creating a microecology that shouldn't exist here at all." She said this with real satisfaction, as if finding something that shouldn't exist was better than finding something that should. "And that's significant," he said. "It's extraordinary," she said, with the simple conviction of someone who doesn't need agreement to believe what they know. "It means magic and ecology aren't separate systems. They respond to each other. Your ward energy is essentially functioning as a climate." She paused. "Have you ever noticed it?" He looked at the flower. He had lived next to it for decades without once thinking about why it grew there. "No," he said. "Most people don't," she said without judgment, Proximity makes things invisible. They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable. A small bird landed near her boot, pecked twice at the ground, and departed. She watched it go with the same quality of attention she gave everything. "How long have you been doing this work?" he asked. "Since I was 12, she said. "My father was a gardener, not a scholarly one, he just loved growing things. He used to tell me that the most important things in any kingdom were the ones nobody was looking at." She smiled, which changed the lines of her face in a way that was, without his intending to notice it, difficult not to notice. He was probably talking about himself, given that gardeners are dramatically undervalued, but I took it as a scientific philosophy. Kael was quiet for a moment. "Your father sounds like someone worth knowing." "He died when I was 17, she said. The grief in it was old and settled, the kind that has been lived with long enough to become part of the landscape of a person. But yes, he was. He didn't offer condolences because he could see she wasn't asking for them. Instead he said, "My mother died before I came into my power, before I understood what any of this was going to be." He gestured once, a small movement that encompassed Ashenmoor, his horns, the copper sky, all of it. She looked at him then directly and without flinching. "Did she know what you were?" "She knew I was different," he said. "She didn't know the scale of it." "Did she mind?" He considered the question, which deserved to be considered. "No," he said finally, "she didn't mind anything about me." The way she looked at him after that, not with pity, not with fascination, but with something quieter and more careful, stayed with him for the rest of the evening. It was the look of someone filing information away not to use against you, but simply to understand you better. He could not recall the last time someone had looked at him that way. The threat arrived on the 9th day. A delegation from the Council of Meridian arrived at the fortress gates without warning or appointment. Kael knew before they were announced what they likely wanted, but knowing and being prepared are different things. The Council of Meridian was one of 3 major political bodies that had spent 2 centuries trying various methods of limiting his territory. They had never succeeded, but they had never quite stopped trying either. They wanted Seren. Not personally, they didn't know she was there, but they had come with information which they presented with the careful diplomatic vagueness of people who believe they are holding leverage. A scholar, they said, from Coldenmere's academy had been tracking a migration path that crossed Kael's territory. They had become interested in her research. They were concerned about her welfare. They had a legal claim through the Coldenmere Treaty to facilitate the return of any detained scholar of neutral standing. It was carefully constructed, Kael admitted to himself, and it meant they had been watching her work before she entered his territory. The question was why. He sent them to the eastern guest hall and took the longer route back through the fortress, thinking. He stopped outside Sura's workshop, where the old demon was repairing a ward crystal, and asked her to look into what Meridian's interest in Seren Vael specifically might be. Sura looked at him over her spectacles. "She's the other half," Sura said for the second time. "That's why everyone's interested." "Say, Sura." "I'll look into it," Sura said, returning to her crystal, "but you should tell her." Tell her what?" "It's about the oracle, about why you're keeping her here beyond 2 weeks, about the fact that you sat on the garden wall for 2 hours yesterday." "I was there for 40 minutes. "I have windows, my lord." He left without answering that, which Sura appeared to find quietly satisfying. He went to the southern garden. Seren was there in the failing amber light, her journal on her knee, writing notes she would probably stay up late finishing. She heard him approaching this time and looked up. Something in his expression reached her before he spoke. "What is it?" she asked. People from Meridian are here, he said. They're asking about you. She went very still, not frightened, but the way a person goes still when something they've been thinking about quietly suddenly demands to be thought about loudly. What kind of people? A council representatives. She exhaled slowly, closed the journal. They want my research. Tell me why, he said. She looked at him with the same directness she gave everything, but there was something else in it now, a hesitation, not dishonest but careful. I discovered something last year, she said, in the third cycle of lumen beetle migration. The beetles follow a path that traces the boundaries of something ancient, a network of original wards, not magical wards like yours, something older, pre-civilizational. I think they're natural energy lines, the way rivers form in landscapes. And I think several political bodies want to know where they run, because whoever maps them has a significant advantage. She paused. I published a preliminary paper I shouldn't have. Kael was quiet for a moment. And the migration path brings you through my territory. Yes. Which means the energy lines run through here. Yes, she met his eyes. I was going to tell you eventually. I didn't know how to frame it without sounding like I came here to extract information about your land. Did you? He asked, and the question was direct and without accusation, which somehow made it harder to answer dishonestly. No, she said, I came for the beetles, but I would have noted the lines if I found evidence of them here. That's the work. I can't not note what I find. He believed her. He wasn't entirely sure why, given that he had spent 400 years learning not to trust first impressions. But belief, like the flower growing in the wrong soil, seemed to find conditions where it had no logical reason to flourish. Stay inside the fortress tonight, he said. I'll deal with Meridian. I can speak to them myself, she said. I know, he said. Let me handle this first. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? It was the right question. He thought about Sura's words, about the fact that you sat on the garden wall for 2 hours, about the way he'd rearranged the ward schedule, about the way the amber light looked different in the garden now, with someone in it who paid actual attention to things. Because I want to, he said simply, and left before she could respond to that, which was becoming something of a pattern. Kael dismissed the Meridian delegation with the particular kind of politeness that left no room for argument, the kind built not from warmth, but from the absolute certainty that there would be no further discussion. They left in the morning and he watched them go from the high window, and then he went to find Sura. She was already waiting for him, which meant she had found something. The prophecy, Sura said, setting down her tools. Someone else knows about it. Kael sat. Meridian. Not them specifically, but whoever is advising them does. Sura folded her hands, which she did when she was about to say something she knew he wouldn't like. The oracle who came to you wasn't the first to have that vision. The same prophecy was recorded in Meridian sealed archives 60 years before your oracle delivered it. 2 powers drawn from opposite ends of creation, etc. They've been looking for both of you for a long time. Why? Because the full text of the prophecy isn't what you were told. He went very still. The oracle who came to you was dying, Sura said, her voice careful. She delivered the warning she didn't finish. The full text as recorded in Meridian's version says that the 2 powers, one of fire and shadow, one of light and living things, do not inevitably destroy each other. They are capable of destroying each other as 2 such forces drawn close create enormous instability. She paused. But if they stabilize instead, if the 2 energies align rather than conflict, the text says the resulting balance would be unlike anything in recorded history. sustainable, generative. It would rewrite the foundational ecology of the region, possibly further. Kael was quiet for a long time. Meridian wants to prevent that. Their power structure depends on scarcity and competition between territories, Sura said. A stable, unified generative power at the center of the continent is not in their interest. She looked at him steadily. They weren't trying to retrieve her research, my lord. They were trying to separate the two of you before anything aligned. He thought about Seren in the garden, about her theory of energy lines that ran beneath the land like rivers, about the unusual violet flowers that grew from ward-enriched soil, about what she had said, your magical infrastructure is creating a microecology that shouldn't exist here at all. He thought about what that meant if her light and his shadow were already, simply through proximity, beginning to respond to each other. He thought about the thing he had not told her. He stood and went to the East Wing library where he had guessed correctly that she would be. She was cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by books she had apparently pulled from 3 different shelves simultaneously, her journal open beside her with a new page already dense with notes. She looked up when he came in, and the quality of his expression reached her immediately, same as the night before. "Sit down," she said, closing the journal. He didn't sit, he stood near the window, which was something he did when he needed to be able to look at something other than whoever he was speaking to. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, "about why I asked you to stay, about why I've been—" He stopped, looked at the window, continued, "about an oracle who came to me 400 years ago." He told her all of it, the original prophecy as he'd heard it, the death of the oracle before she finished, the 40 years he had put it aside, Sura's findings, Meridian's interest, the full text. He told it plainly and without softening the parts that implicated him, including the fact that he had extended her stay under practical pretexts while knowing, somewhere beneath his reasoning, that something was pulling him toward a reason to keep her close. She listened without interrupting, which he had come to understand was how she listened to things that mattered. When he finished, the library was very quiet. The amber light came through the windows at its late afternoon angle. She looked down at her journal for a moment, then back at him. "So when you kept me here," she said, "you didn't know the full prophecy." "No," he said, "I knew the warning, I didn't know the rest." "But you knew something." "I knew something," he agreed. "And you didn't tell me," she said, not accusatory, not hurt, but honest. "No," he said, "I didn't." She was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" He turned from the window, "Because telling you would have made it real in a way I wasn't ready for, and because I wasn't sure what you would do with it." He met her eyes. "And because it was easier to pretend that I was keeping you here for administrative reasons than to admit that the oracle's words had spent 4 centuries as background noise in my mind, and that you walked into my marsh and somehow everything went quiet." She looked at him, and the quality of that look, the green-eyed, careful, full attention quality that she gave to violet flowers and architectural spiders, and now to him, was something he didn't quite know how to hold. "I'm angry," she said. "I know. Not about the prophecy, I can deal with a prophecy." She stood, which reorganized the space between them. "I'm angry that you made a decision about what information I could handle. I've been here almost 2 weeks and you've had the full picture for less than a day, but you've had half the picture for the entire time and you chose to hold it." "Yes," he said, he did not defend this because it didn't deserve defense. She took a breath, let it out. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "I'm acknowledging the anger so I can move past it and think clearly," she said with the matter-of-fact pragmatism that was apparently how she processed emotional responses. "I'm a researcher, I need full information. You understand that now? We won't do that again." She looked at him. "Will we?" It wasn't quite a question. No, he said, we won't. She nodded once, then she said, tell me about your power, what it actually is, not what the legends say. He had not talked about his power to anyone except Sura in approximately 3 centuries. He looked at his hands where the iridescence lived just beneath the skin. It's old, he said, older than me. I was born into it the way some people are born into kingdoms without choosing it, without fully understanding it until it's already shaped everything about your life. He sat down on the low bench near the shelves, which was the closest he'd come to sitting in her presence since the garden wall. It's fire and shadow at the base level, heat without light, darkness without absence. It can destroy, obviously, but what most people don't understand is that destruction isn't its primary nature. Its primary nature is stability through pressure. I hold things together by being a force that cannot be moved. My territory is safe not because I've frightened everything out of it, but because the power I carry creates a foundation that other forces can't easily disrupt. She was watching him intently. A structural force, she said. Yes. And mine is generative, she said half to herself. Growth, movement, organic systems. She was quiet for a moment. Structure and growth, a foundation and what's built on it. She looked up at him. Kael, that's not destruction, that's architecture. He looked at her for a long moment. Sura thinks so too. Sura is very smart. Don't tell her that, she already knows. Something shifted in Seren's expression, a lightness small but genuine that passed like sun through a brief gap in clouds. It was not the right moment for it given everything, and yet it was exactly the right moment and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, which was somehow more significant than saying it. The night grew around the library. She stayed. They talked for hours about the energy lines she had mapped, about the way his ward structures might relate to the ancient lines running beneath the land, about what Meridian's interference meant for both their territories, about what the complete prophecy implied and what they could do about it. It was not a romantic conversation. It was two intelligent people trying to understand a complex situation that had implications for both their lives, and the fact that it was also deeply intimate was something that accumulated quietly in the background, recognizable only in retrospect. At some point she fell asleep in the chair across from him, the journal still open in her lap, her head tilted at an angle that would guarantee a sore neck in the morning. He sat for a while longer, watching the amber light give way entirely to the dark, thinking about what she had said. That's not destruction, that's architecture. He had spent 400 years understanding himself as a force that had to be carefully contained. He had built Ashenmoor's entire governance around managing the danger of his own power, not channeling it, not using it generously, but restricting it, keeping it from causing harm. He had never once considered that the restriction itself might be the mistake. He was tired of being afraid of himself. He had not known he was afraid until she named it differently. He took the journal from her lap without waking her, set it on the shelf beside her, and left to deal with something he should have dealt with long ago. Meridian had not actually left. 3 of their agents had remained behind, concealed in the Midnight Marsh with the specific intention of disrupting the Northern Ward reset. Kael's scouts found them at dawn and he understood immediately what they were doing. If the wards went down at the wrong point in the reset sequence, the disruption would propagate through the entire ward network, including the ancient energy lines Seren had mapped. It would scatter whatever was slowly, naturally aligning beneath the surface of his territory. It would make the geography hostile, hostile specifically to the kind of warm, growing, light-born power that Seren carried. They were not trying to kill her, they were trying to make the land itself incompatible with her presence. He went to the marsh himself, which was the kind of decision that his council would have argued against, and which he made in the time it took to put his coat on. There was no real conflict. 3 agents against a 400-year-old demon lord in his own territory was not a battle so much as a conversation with a predetermined conclusion. But dismantling what they had partially set up in the ward structure took time and precision, because disrupting it carelessly would cause the exact damage he was trying to prevent. He was in the marsh for 3 hours. By the time he returned, Seren had woken, found the journal neatly placed on the shelf, correctly identified this as something he had done, and by some method he couldn't entirely account for, had figured out where he'd gone. She was in the ward room when he came back, looking at the ward structures with the same expression she used for architectural spiders. Sura was standing beside her, explaining something with gestures that suggested significant enthusiasm. When Kael entered, both of them turned. "Meridian's agents," Seren said. "Handled," he said. "The wards are stable." She searched his face for something and apparently found it. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. You've been in the marsh for 3 hours." "I'm aware of how long I was in the marsh." Sura made a sound that was very close to a laugh and very carefully wasn't, and removed herself from the room with the practiced discretion of someone who has long since accepted her employer's emotional limitations and finds them endearing. They stood in the wardroom, which was one of the most functional and least comfortable spaces in Ashenmoor. Low ceilings, the constant low hum of active wards, shelves of crystals that were doing important structural work. It was not the setting for the conversation they were about to have. It was, however, where they were. "I've been thinking," Seren said, "about what you told me last night and what I said about architecture." "So have I," he said. "And I want to be honest with you," she said, "which I think is the thing we've established we're both required to be with each other." "Yes," he said. "I'm not afraid of the prophecy," she said. "I wasn't afraid when you told me, and I've thought about it enough since then to know that the absence of fear isn't naivety. I understand what it means, 2 forces that can either conflict or align, and I think," she started again, "I think something is already aligning. I noticed it when I got here. The garden feels different than it should. My notes from the past week show that the lumen beetle patterns are stabilizing in ways they haven't in 3 previous cycles. The microecology isn't just ward-influenced. Something is responding to both of us being in the same place." He nodded slowly. "I know. And that's not a problem," she said. "That's information. What we do with it is a choice." "Meridian will keep trying," he said. "If they believe the prophecy is moving toward the alignment outcome, they'll escalate." "I know that too," she said. "I'm not suggesting we ignore consequences. I'm suggesting that letting other people's fear of the outcome determine what outcome we pursue is." She shook her head. "I spent my whole career studying systems that work together without anyone telling them to. The ecology doesn't ask permission to function. It finds the arrangement that sustains itself." She looked at him directly, with the full green eyes on the thing quality that she gave to everything she decided was worth understanding. "I want to stay." Something in his chest, which had been held carefully in one position for a very long time, moved. "This is my territory," he said. "The risk of Meridian's interference falls on me, not on you." "I'm already in it," she said. "That's not a reason for me to leave, that's a reason for us to deal with it." "You're a scholar," he said, "a researcher with a small academy and a very ambitious mission statement. You didn't sign on for political conflict with a major council." "I didn't sign on for any of this," she agreed. "I was following beetles. A pause, but here I am, and I'm not leaving because the situation got complicated. Complicated situations are where the most important findings occur. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about 400 years of amber sunrises watched alone, about the weight of managing a power he'd always understood as something to be controlled rather than shared, about a dying oracle who had only given him half the story and what the full story meant, and whether he was brave enough to pursue it. You understand, he said carefully, that if you stay not as a visiting scholar with temporary access to the garden, but as someone who stays, the alignment the prophecy describes will continue. You'll be part of my world, my politics, my enemies, my mess. Your microecology, she said with the smallest possible smile. That's so. She waited, which was something she was good at, waiting without anxiety for someone to finish the process they were in the middle of. I haven't wanted someone to stay in a very long time, he said. I've spent a significant amount of effort making sure that wanting didn't become something I had to manage. He looked at the hum of the wards, then back at her. I'm telling you this not as a sentiment but as information, because we've established that's how we operate. That's the most carefully framed admission of genuine feeling I've ever heard, she said. I have a reputation to manage. No, she said, and her voice was gentle and clear. You have a reputation, managing it has made you very lonely, that's different. He had no answer to that, which was in itself an answer. She crossed the space between them and did something simple. She put her hand just briefly against his arm, fingers light on the fabric of his sleeve, a touch that asked for nothing and offered something that he didn't have a word for but recognized clearly as warmth. Not the metaphorical warmth of a pleasant moment, but an actual quality, the same thing his scouts had reported in the marsh, the same thing that had been slowly, steadily, naturally growing in the garden all week. He put his hand over hers, that was all, just that. They worked together for the following month to address Meridian's interference, using a combination of diplomatic precision and the kind of strategic creativity that happens when a scholar who understands systems and a ruler who understands power are working toward the same goal. Kael sent formal communications to the other two major councils, neither of which were allies of Meridian, framing the incursion into his territory as what it was, a destabilizing political maneuver, and leveraging the long-standing agreements that made his territory a neutral center of the continent. Seren, for her part, published her full research on the ancient energy lines, not just the preliminary paper but the complete documented findings, which removed Meridian's ability to use information scarcity as leverage and simultaneously elevated the Academy of Living Sciences to the kind of academic significance that its mission statement had always claimed. The response from the wider world was significant. The energy line findings reframed the understanding of how magical infrastructure and natural ecology were related, and the implications moved through scholarly and political communities simultaneously. It did not solve every problem, but it changed the landscape of the problem, which was, as Seren had always maintained, what good research was supposed to do. The alignment the prophecy had described continued to develop slowly and without drama, which was not how Kael had imagined prophetic fulfillment working, but was entirely consistent with how Seren approached most things. The violet flowers spread from the garden into areas of the fortress grounds that had never supported them. The lumen beetles, in their next cycle 3.5 years later, followed a path that was measurably more stable than any previous migration. The ward system and the natural energy lines of the land, studied together by the two people who understood each of them best, turned out to be different expressions of the same underlying structure, one built, one grown, both essential, neither sufficient without the other. Kael watched a morning come from the same window where he had watched 400 others come before it. The copper-bruised light fell across Ashenmoor, across the expanded gardens where someone was already outside despite the early hour, crouched over a journal. He watched for a moment, then put on his coat and went downstairs. She heard him coming through the garden. She had been hearing him for some time now, which was a significant development given that most people didn't hear him until he chose to be heard. "There's a new species in the East Bed," she said without looking up. "I'm almost certain it's new. I've never documented anything with this exact petal structure. I think the ward energy is doing something unusual to its cellular formation." He crouched beside her. She turned the journal so he could see the drawing, meticulous, careful, alive with the particular quality of attention she gave to everything she decided was worth understanding. The flower was small and improbable, growing in soil that had no technical reason to support it, in a fortress that had no technical reason to contain a scholar of luminescent invertebrates. It was dark at its center and bright at its edges, or bright at its center and dark at its edges, depending on the angle of the light. "What are you going to name it?" he said. She considered, pencil resting against her lip. "Something that captures both conditions," she said. "The dark and the light, the fire and the living thing." She glanced at him. "I'll think of something." He sat beside her in the garden as the amber morning built around them, unhurried, not going anywhere. The air held that quality it always held now, not warmer exactly, but more itself, as if the atmosphere of Ashenmoor had finally stopped deciding between two possible versions of what it wanted to be. The prophecy had said they would destroy each other. The prophecy had not accounted for the particular stubbornness of a woman who followed beetles through hostile marshes, or the quiet exhaustion of a man who had spent 4 centuries being afraid of his own power. It had not accounted for conversations in libraries that ran past midnight, or hands placed gently on sleeves, or the way two forces, given enough time and honesty, might discover that what looked like opposition was actually the shape of something that wanted to hold together. Somewhere in Meridian's sealed archives, the full text of the prophecy still sat in its leather binding, understood by people who had read it as a warning and a resource. They had not been wrong that it described something powerful. They had simply been wrong about what to do with power when it chose, against all expectation, to become something generous. The flower in the east bed caught the morning light and held it, the way good things do, not by refusing to change, but by being exactly what they were, in the particular conditions that made them possible. Seren wrote its name in the margin of the journal page, in the small, precise handwriting she used for things she intended to be permanent. Kael read it over her shoulder and said nothing because some things don't require words, and he was finally learning which ones they were.